listen to me. This is important.
Look, I know you're scared, but you need to trust me.
It was barely past sunrise, the sky still painted in soft orange and lavender, when John stepped into his kitchen with a steaming mug of coffee and glanced, almost out of habit, at the feed from his security cameras. But this morning, something felt off even before he fully understood what he was seeing. A slow-moving SUV crawled up his gravel driveway, its headlights still on despite the daylight. It wasn't a police car, wasn't a delivery truck, and definitely wasn't a neighbor. The logo on the driver's door made John's eyebrows pull together. Maple Ridge HOA Patrol. His farm wasn't just outside the Maple Ridge HOA. It was outside every HOA district for miles. They had no jurisdiction, no reason, and absolutely no right to be there. John leaned closer to the screen. Behind the SUV, two more vehicles rolled in like a miniature convoy. In the lead car, he spotted her immediately. Karen, the notorious president of Maple Ridge HOA, known locally for her obsession with aesthetic standards and her habit of inserting herself into everyone's property matters, whether invited or not. Her sunglasses were perched high on her head like some kind of crown, her lips pursed in disapproval, even though she hadn't stepped foot on the property yet. She didn't walk so much as march, shoulders stiff, clipboard clutched to her chest like it was a badge of power. Behind her stepped three men in matching dark jackets, each carrying something different: bolt cutters, a thick binder, and what looked unsettlingly like an inspection kit. They positioned themselves like a tactical team preparing for a breach. One pointed at John's fence line, another whispered something while flipping through the binder, and all of them nodded at Karen like soldiers taking orders. But the part that made John's pulse spike was when one of them walked straight up to the gate lock, tested it, then signaled to the man with the cutters. John didn't even have time to react before. Clamp. Snap. The lock broke clean in two. His private gate swung open. The so-called patrol team filed in with an authority they absolutely did not possess, stepping onto his land like they owned it. "Spread out," Karen ordered, her voice sharp, echoing across the morning air. "Take pictures of every violation. This place is a mess. The board will back me on this." Violations? On a rural farm? John watched in disbelief as the men walked toward his barn, pointing at random objects: an old tractor, a pile of lumber, some coiled fencing material, as if they were signs of criminal behavior instead of typical farm supplies. They weren't just trespassing. They were preparing to cite him for HOA violations that didn't even apply to him. John clenched his jaw. He didn't step outside yet, because inside the house, just a room away, sat Sheriff Douglas, flipping through a file filled with documents, survey maps, and the complaint John had filed last night. The sheriff had come over personally early that morning to go over the details, since this wasn't the first time the HOA had tried something like this. But today, Karen had crossed a line so bold, so reckless, that even the sheriff had raised an eyebrow when John told him who the troublemaker was. From where he sat, the sheriff could also see the same security feed on John's tablet. He paused mid-sentence as the patrol team stepped farther onto the property. "Well," he muttered, leaning forward and squinting at the screen, "I'll be damned. They really did it. They broke your gate." John felt his heartbeat in his temples. "I told you. Last night, she said she'd handle it herself. I didn't think she meant invading the property." On the cameras, Karen strutted toward the farmhouse as if she were approaching the stage of a beauty pageant. She ran a finger across the railing of John's porch, checking for dust, unbelievably, and then scribbled something on her clipboard with dramatic flair. Behind her, one patrol member photographed the broken lock as if it were evidence against John. "She's acting like this is some HOA-owned playground," John hissed, trying to keep his voice steady. The sheriff slowly stood up, placing a hand on his belt, his expression shifting from mild disbelief to simmering irritation. "They're digging themselves deeper with every step. This is trespassing, vandalism, forced entry, possibly even attempted extortion if they try to levy fines." Outside, The patrol team circled around the barn, discussing non-compliant structures and unauthorized vehicles. One man even tried to climb onto John's tractor before Karen slapped his hand away and said, "Not yet. First we document everything. If he resists, we'll escalate with penalties." Penalties for a man not even part of their HOA. Karen moved with the air of someone who fully believed she was the law, the judge, and the executioner. She paused in the middle of the yard, planted her hands on her hips, and scanned the property with a look of dramatic disgust. Her voice carried across the fields when she said, "This is unacceptable. The board will approve immediate action. This whole place is lowering the property value of Maple Ridge." John stared at the monitor in stunned silence. His farm was nearly 3 miles from Maple Ridge. You couldn't even see it from their neighborhood. The sheriff shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This woman's about to learn the hard way that real law doesn't tolerate HOA fantasies." And still, the patrol team kept digging deeper. They opened his tool shed. They inspected his fencing as if it were theirs. One man even bent down to measure weed height, mumbling something about overgrowth violations. Karen strutted toward the barn, flipping pages in her clipboard, already imagining the dozens of imaginary fines she planned to impose, but she still had no idea, not even a hint, that the sheriff was not only on the property, he was already inside the house, watching everything, preparing to step out and confront them at exactly the right moment. The morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the field. The trespass continued. Karen grew bolder, John grew angrier, and the sheriff grew quieter, his silence the kind that always came right before a storm. The so-called patrol team had now spread across nearly every corner of John's property, acting like a rogue task force on a mission. One man was photographing the chicken coop as if it were some kind of secret hideout. Another was crouched in the dirt measuring the distance between fence posts, muttering to himself about improper spacing and unregistered structural items. The third was circling John's old tractor, poking it, kicking the tires, and loudly declaring it unsafe for community aesthetics, even though it had nothing to do with any community within miles. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying the chaos she had unleashed. She raised a bright yellow megaphone. Yes, an actual megaphone, and shouted toward the farmhouse in a tone dripping with authority she did not possess. "John, come out immediately. You are required to comply with Maple Ridge HOA Code 4B. This is your final warning." Her voice echoed across the open fields, bouncing off the barn and startling the livestock. To anyone passing by, it would appear as though she were leading a full-scale raid on a criminal hideout instead of harassing a peaceful farmer on private land. The patrol team, emboldened by her dramatic display, crept up the porch steps. One reached for the doorknob with the clear intention of forcing an entry inspection. Another began taking pictures of the firewood stack next to the door, labeling it dangerously unorganized in his notebook. Karen barked, "Document everything. This place is a disaster." But before any of them could take another step, the front door swung open, and standing there, perfectly calm, perfectly composed, holding a steaming mug of coffee as if this were the most ordinary morning in the world, was Sheriff Daniels. His presence hit the trespassers like a cold bucket of water. "Put those cameras down," he said, his deep voice slicing straight through the noise, "and step away from the property. All of you." The patrol team froze mid-step, mid-breath, mid-excuse. Even the man with the bolt cutters looked like he'd just been caught cutting into a bank vault. The group collectively stiffened as if gravity itself had tightened. Karen, however, took a second too long to process what she was seeing. When she finally did, she blinked rapidly, her confidence faltering. But her pride was too bloated to let her back down. She shoved her sunglasses farther up her forehead, stepped forward with theatrical authority, and snapped, "Sheriff, please step aside. This farm is in violation of HOA Code 4B and requires immediate inspection. These structures are non-compliant, and this man is..." Daniels didn't even let her finish. He lifted a thick folder from his other hand. The official, county stamp land deed, complete with boundary maps and certified documents. Then he unfolded a large printed district map in front of her, wide enough for the patrol team to see. Maple Ridge HOA, the sheriff said plainly, tapping a spot on the map, has zero jurisdiction here. None. Your boundaries end. He dragged his finger across the paper, stopping firmly, 3.4 miles away. The silence that followed was immediate and total. Karen's jaw slowly unhinged. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like someone had unplugged her from her own ego. One of the patrol team members quietly lowered his camera. Another hid the bolt cutters behind his leg, as if that would erase what he had done. Daniels wasn't finished. He turned his stern sheriff's gaze on the man behind her. "You three," he said, "have just committed criminal trespassing, property damage through forced entry, unauthorized inspection, and unlawful intimidation. All of which," he added, "are arrestable offenses." The three men reacted instantly. "Sir, we didn't mean," she told us, "this was allowed. We thought this was a community inspection." They were talking over each other, voices trembling, hands raised slightly, as if facing an actual arrest. One of them dropped the bolt cutters with a metallic clatter, flinching as if they might explode on impact. Karen snapped back to life, her panic morphing not into humility, but into frantic deflection. "Sheriff, this is a misunderstanding," she stammered. "John is lying. He forged those maps. He misled us. He set a trap. He wanted us to come so he could—" Daniels raised a hand sharply. "Enough." Karen froze mid-sentence, mouth still open. "You broke into private property," he said. "You damaged a gate that wasn't yours. You harassed a resident outside your authority. You frightened livestock and violated multiple state laws." Karen sputtered, "But this is lowering our property values." The sheriff gave her a long, cold stare. "Ma'am, your property values end 3 towns over." With that, he stepped forward, pulling a small camera from his belt. He began photographing their patrol vehicles, license plates, driver IDs, equipment, everything. He radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Daniels. I need 2 additional units at the Miller farm. I have a private HOA patrol trespassing and a potential forced entry incident." Karen's eyes widened in horror. No. Sheriff, you can't detain me. I'm the HOA president." "That title," Daniels said as he logged timestamps and coordinates, "is not a shield against the law." He jotted down notes, took pictures of their bolt cutters, and recorded their positions on the property while the patrol team stood there stiff as fence posts. "Ma'am," Daniels finally said, "you will be detained for questioning. As for your team, they will remain here until deputies arrive." Karen's knees visibly wobbled. The reality of the situation and of her own untouchable fantasy collapsing was settling in like a cold wind. She opened her mouth again, grasping for some excuse, some authority, some imaginary rule to hide behind, but nothing came. Sheriff Daniels didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, which somehow made it worse. The patrol team stood silent. Karen stood trembling, and John watched from the doorway as the truth, finally, began to catch up with the woman who had made his life miserable for months. The calm countryside morning had turned into a full-blown scene of flashing lights and official vehicles lined along John's driveway by the time backup deputies arrived. The moment the second patrol car rolled up, Karen's composure, thin as paper already, finally tore apart. Her earlier swagger evaporated, replaced by a frantic, trembling panic that made her voice crack each time she tried to speak. Even the trespassing officers who had followed her onto the property now stood several feet away from her. Not wanting to be associated with the disaster she had dragged them into, deputies began surveying the property with practiced precision. They photographed the broken gate lock still lying in the grass. They documented the deep tire ruts carved into John's field by the HOA patrol trucks. They inspected the shed door Karen's men had forced open. Every flash of the camera seemed to make Karen jump, as if each picture was another nail in the coffin of her lies. In a desperate attempt to save herself, she began pointing fingers in every direction except her own. "These men acted without asking me," she insisted. "They misunderstood my instructions. They used the GPS wrong. I never told them to come here. I thought this property was abandoned. Then she even tried. The sheriff tricked us. He lured us here. But every excuse fell apart the moment it left her mouth. Sheriff Daniels, now fully in the rhythm of an interrogation he had performed hundreds of times, didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. He simply asked calm, precise questions that left no room to escape. Who broke the gate? You gave the order, didn't you? Why did you claim HOA jurisdiction here? Show me the authorization you mentioned. Which county official approved this expansion? Name them. Each question made her face pale, a shade lighter. Each answer, or lack of one, made the deputies exchange knowing glances. Karen stumbled over her own contradictions until she finally stopped talking altogether, realizing that silence was safer than digging herself deeper. Meanwhile, the three patrol members slowly stepped forward to make their own statements. And unlike Karen, they didn't bother lying. Their voices were low and uneasy. She told us the county gave private approval. She said this was our new zone and that pushback was expected. She said any complaints would be handled by her directly. We didn't even want to be here, Sheriff. One of them swallowed hard and added, she told us this farm was a hazard and that we might have to force compliance. Sheriff Daniels nodded grimly. Coercion, abuse of authority, manipulation. It all fit the pattern he had suspected for weeks, but hadn't yet been able to prove. By noon, the decision was made. Karen stood next to the patrol SUV, shaking as Daniels approached. Her sunglasses were crooked, her clipboard hung limply from her fingers, and her voice was barely a whisper when she said, Sheriff, please. I was only trying to improve the community by breaking the law. Daniels asked gently. Though the weight of the moment was unmistakable, she didn't answer. The sheriff motioned to his deputies. Karen flinched as cold metal cuffs wrapped around her wrists. Her breaths grew rapid, uneven, the humiliation of being escorted to the patrol car, while the very men she commanded stared at the ground. Ashamed to look at her was worse than the charges themselves. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't the loudest voice. She wasn't the authority. She was just another person who thought power meant ownership and learned otherwise. The final list of charges was read clearly. Trespassing, coercion, property damage, false representation of authority, attempted intimidation. Karen sank into the back seat of the patrol car, unable to muster a single protest. Within 48 hours, the Maple Ridge HOA board held an emergency meeting, not to support her, not to defend her, but to remove her permanently. In fact, her misconduct had been brewing for months. Unauthorized fines, false warnings, power-tripping confrontations with neighbors, and now a criminal-level incident. Her removal came with unanimous votes. Her reputation collapsed with it. Back at the farm, John spent the next few days repairing the gate, smoothing the tire tracks, and installing an extra set of cameras along the property line, just in case. But for the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Peace. True, quiet peace, the kind that belongs only to people who have fought their battles the right way. A week later, just as the sun was setting and turning the fields gold, Sheriff Daniels pulled up in his cruiser. He stepped out with his usual slow, steady calm and walked to John's porch, admiring the freshly repaired gate and the neatly restored entrance. You got the place looking good again, he said. John smiled. Feels good to breathe without expecting someone to storm the property. The sheriff took a sip from a thermos he carried everywhere and looked out at the horizon. People like her, he said thoughtfully, think authority comes from shouting, from pushing people around, from pretending they're in charge. He tapped his badge with one finger. But real authority? It comes from law, from truth, from doing what's right even when it's hard. John nodded slowly, watching the breeze roll through the grass. Those words settled deep in his chest. He realized now that he hadn't won because he fought harder. He had won because he stood on the side of truth while the right people stood guard beside him. As the light faded and the last colors of dusk painted the farmhouse roof, John understood something he would never forget. Some battles aren't won by shouting back. Some battles are won by patience, by evidence, by courage, and by letting justice take the lead. He closed his gate for the night, confident that this time it would stay peaceful.